Thank you. I didn't even give the talk yet. You don't have to applaud me. It's a beautiful weather outside, so it's weird that you're inside here. There's still time to leave if you want to. So, this horrible title, what a douchey title, Communication Wins the Game. What I want to talk to you about today in this particular room is the greatest tool at the analyst's disposal. Like, what is the one tool that trumps them all? And the secret is in the title, but I'll leave it as a cliffhanger, so you'll just have to wait until you hear what I say about it. But I want to talk about organizations, I want to talk about how we run our businesses with data, and I want to talk about how that all comes together in this weird little mixture of people and processes. I represent a company called 8-Bit Sheep. There's just 5 of us based in Helsinki, Finland, trying to figure out what we want to do with data, as probably most people here. So we're all just trying to figure out what to do. Some of us sell stuff, some of us buy stuff, some of us build stuff, but we're all trying to figure out what we want to do with data. And in this capacity, I also very loosely represent Google. I'm not on the Google payroll, but they have elevated me to this kind of Google expert program where I talk about Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager to very different audiences, like this one here today, but also to developers around the world, to marketing people around the world, and together we try to figure out what the hell we're doing, and because we don't know, nobody knows what we're doing, but we're just trying to make the best of it. My voice is a bit down. I woke up the day before yesterday with no voice, so there was absolutely no sound coming from my throat, so I've just been eating honey all yesterday, so now I have some voice back, so let's hope it lasts. And then I'll just mime. I'll show you stuff instead of talking if I run out of voice. There'll be some time for questions after this. Please, only easy questions. No difficult questions, please. No, that's fine. Just ask whatever you want. So, there's a lot of, it's easy to kind of talk about data quality, right? Because there's always, every time you look at a data set, some people will say, wow, that's good quality data. And then someone else will say, wow, that's really bad quality data. So the way we look at data is always kind of dependent on our perspectives, where we're coming from, what our backgrounds are, what our competencies are. I've always tried to avoid those arguments because they just end up going around in circles. And we always end up kind of blaming the tools, or we end up blaming the business processes, or we end up blaming something like the data set or something. And the one thing I found, and the one thing I want to talk about today is that it's never the tools, it's never the business processes, it's how we communicate within these organizations. And the communication structures that are the absolute fundamental thing that any organization that wants to use data have to nurture and establish. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is how these communication structures build our daily lives as analysts and people who work with data, and how we can actually improve those processes. And we start with this idea that there are companies out there who are proficient with a tool or with a set of tools. There are, hundreds and thousands of Google Analytics consultation companies. I'm sure there are companies in Russia as well whose sole focus is to be like ridiculously good at using GA. And they consult and they come to clients and they help them use GA. And they're known for being good with GA. And that's cool. But I tend to think of those companies as companies that have a single purpose of being those tool experts. And the problem with being like a tool expert solely means that you're really good at tactics. You're really good at magic tricks. You're really good at the fabled low-hanging fruit. You're good at finding those problems that the clients have, and maybe you're in-house, you're good at finding those problems that your company has, and you're good at fixing them. But in the end of the day, what you're actually doing is you're just elevating the level of what is appropriate to a certain level, like what is acceptable as data quality. You're not really necessarily thinking about the business problems behind your decisions to use those tools. And this has given this rise to this cult of the new, like how many people have heard the words AI strategy? AI strategy, artificial intelligence strategy. Well, only one hand went out, but all of you have heard them. So It's like we have these tools and we have these hammers, and now we're just looking for problems to fix with those tools. So these tools tend to exist in a vacuum, and we try to sell these tools as liberating us somehow. Learn the tools and your data quality will improve. But the problem is that they're isolated. They're isolated from the business problems. So to balance this out, there are companies and there are people who focus on the business problems. They're amazing at finding the problems. They're amazing at throwing the problems out there in the boardrooms, waving their hands and showing the whiteboards and the PowerPoint presentations and talking to the CEO and saying, we have problems and we have a business strategy that needs to be followed. But these typically miss one component, that is understanding what the tool expertise of the company is. What is the underlying foundation? What can we do? It's so easy to be a consultant. I can go into any room and just say, you have problems, you have, like Oprah, you have problems, you have problems, you have problems. But I don't have any solutions because I don't understand why you have those problems, what tools broke down, what problems you have with data quality. So these business experts, they tend to exist in a similar vacuum. They're just waving their hands and throwing around words like strategy and organizational processes, malfunctions, and synergies. They're not actually giving solutions. So what is the solution to this problem? Well, let's build a company that has both tool and business expertise. Amazing insight. 5 minutes into the talk. Let's hire the right people. Let's hire the right consultants. Let's hire the right mix of people. But what do you end up with in the worst case scenario? You have great experts working with the tools, great developers. You have great people in their black suits telling the boardroom how things are. But there's no communication between the two. So if something breaks down, well, what the developers will say, you gave us a bad specification, your documentation sucked. And the business people will say, well, you're just not doing your job. You didn't read our documentation properly. So we have these people fighting each other, and there's territorialism. It wasn't me, it was them, it was me, it was them. So what are we missing? We have the competencies, we have the people with the skills. We're missing maturity. We're missing the big fact that we're supposed to be adults. And I have a 2-year-old kid who's now in daycare, and I feel like many times he's so much more mature than the companies I work with. Like he's so much more adult than the people I work with, because at least he's honest about what he's doing. He's honest about his tantrums. He's honest about being hungry. But these companies that we work with and the companies that we're in-house with, they fail to realize that they've just hired lots and lots of good people, but they have silos, and these silos are rooted in history. In software development, we often talk about technical debt, which is when bad processes are being built on bad processes, and we hire more and more good people, but because the foundation is rotten, the technical debt accumulates. And it's the same thing with organizations. You can hire all the best people, but if you don't do something about those silos, it's all going to be for nothing in the long run. You'll still end up with bad data quality, but it will be more and more expensive because you've spent so much time focusing on the hiring. So communication strategies and maturity is what I want to talk about. And it all boils down to this. This is a wonderful person, Mel Conway. He's a computer scientist from the US. Sorry. And in the late 60s, he was presenting and he talked about this idea, which was later coined into Conway's Law. And I'll just read, this is stupid reading from the slides, but any organization that designs a system will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. And what he meant with that, this is back in the 60s when computers were the size of this hall. So let's say we have two teams. One is working on this big computer here, and one is working with this big computer here. And Conway's Law says that if these two computers need to communicate with each other, if they need to pass data from each other, if they need to have something built together, then if the people operating those machines, the engineers and the people just running those processes, if they do not communicate or if they have failures of communication, then anything that those computers try to do will also mirror those imperfections. So we have faulty systems because we have faulty communication structures. And this theory has been tested a number of times, and it's been shown over and over again to be very robust in the world of computer science. And when we move that to the marketing world and the analytics world, well, what is analytics and data, except something that needs to flow from one system to another, right? Every single company is producing ridiculous amounts of data by the second, but this data is usually a mixture of different systems having a similar output. And the one thing about data that I suppose we can all agree is that it's brutally honest. You can look at a data set, and if you look at it closely enough, it will show you the imperfections of the organization that produced that data set. You'll see missing values where the communication between the data source and the engineer didn't work. You'll see incorrectly formatted values when two different departments didn't agree on how many decimals we should have in the product revenue or whatever we're measuring. And you'll see latency in the systems because there wasn't communication between those who need the data and those who produce the data on should it be streaming or batching data. So we have communication problems that are underlying the things we see that are perceived as data quality issues. So data quality becomes an investment not only into tools so that we always get the best tool for our data, or the business strategy so that we have the people who understand what to do with the data, but it becomes an investment on the communication between those people. We need to, and this is like, we're humans here. We know how difficult it is to talk to a dickhead, like somebody who's an annoying person. We know how difficult it is. And every company has an annoying person who happens to be very fundamental to that organization's survival. So we have to build these communication structures against our very best nature. We have to build them because that's the only way we can break down those silos. And in today's digital organizations, we have these multidisciplinary teams. It's very rare to build an advertising campaign or an A/B test without involving a designer, somebody from development, somebody from marketing, somebody from business, and an analyst. Like, this is a very typical set of roles you would see in a digital project, a data project or a marketing project. But what happens in these companies that have failed to understand the importance of communication is that we only have a handful of people at a given time working on the project. So the most typical dynamic happens if it's a digital, like an app or a website, the developers are working on the project. They work, they write code, they write code, they write code, they write code, then they publish something, and then everybody else looks at the result. If it's an A/B test, the UX team will be very involved as well because they need to develop the variants and so on. But what's the problem here? We have all these stakeholders that are fundamental somehow to the project, but they're only peripherally there. They're not actually even there. They're just hovering around the company. So what happens is that people are not talking to each other, and this means that there's actually a lack of shared goals, and this leads to so many problems in the long run. The developers publish a release, and then everybody looks at it and says, wait, that's not what we wanted. That's not at all like what we specified and designed. It's a typical waterfall model. So because there's a lack of communication, the output is always damaged, and it takes so much time to fix something that's already been released. No amount of A/B testing will help that paradox. So how do we fix this? Ta-da! We build those communication structures. We force people to communicate. We sit them down face to face and tell them, now talk. So we add these lines between the people. We add a weekly meeting between the business people and the marketing people. We had a periodical meeting between the data people and the developers and so on. So we build these communication structures. And this is good. People are now talking. People involved in the project are talking, hopefully, about the project. But the problem is, they're talking to each other and not to the whole team. So it's very easy to just throw meetings. Let's have another meeting. Let's have another meeting. And then to send a group email where you CC everybody in the company just to be sure. And you invite everybody into these meetings and nothing happens. But this is the first step. The problem with this approach is that people are talking, but they're not necessarily talking about the project. And it typically evolves into this game of Chinese whispers where some people who are involved with the project tell others how the project is doing. Then the others say what they heard and they'll tell that to the next person. So that message keeps getting garbled, and in the end they're talking about something completely different than the project. So this is an okay way to approach it. This is how many companies do when they realize that communication is the problem. They start having meetings. So what is the correct or not the correct, I hate using that word, what is an appropriate way to solve this? It's to have them all talk about the project. And like, this is mind-blowing stuff. It's fundamental, so innovative. But honestly, it's so difficult to do this. How many people have been working with Agile? Agile, Lean, Scrum, whatever you want to call it. So you know that these frameworks are founded on the principle of doing things together. So we're constantly communicating. Scrum has a calendar full of stuff for you to do with the team. There's daily stand-up meetings, there's backlog grooming, there's sprint planning, there's retrospectives, introspectives, there's a demo every Friday or every second Friday, and so on. So the whole idea of Agile is to force people to talk to each other, but force them to talk about the project and the group working on the project. And that's one of the reasons why I'm a huge fan of Agile, is because it has built in the understanding that this type of communication is fundamental for the survival of the project. So we have these people work together. And by the way, I don't know if you, as an analyst, if you're an analyst, if you've been frustrated in Agile projects, but it's one of the best places for you to shine. Because Scrum, for example, has a demo at the end of every sprint where you showcase what you did. And that's the perfect place for you to show all the data you've been collecting, the dashboards, the A/B tests you've been doing, and show the company the value of your work. But it requires that you sit down together. And it is by this fusion of people around the project that we start to get rid of those communication problems. So now, because I'm not taking instant feedback, I'm going to tell you that this is the right way to do it. I won't hear any objections. But what's the next step? Now people are talking, and people are talking about the project. So now we have to make sure that the quality of what they're doing is good. The quality of those talks are good. They're talking about the right things. And many companies, in this stage of the game, when they're already focused on the project, they tend to do one thing, which is hire a consultant. So they hire experts to help them move the process around. They hire experts to fill in the gaps in their own competences. And this is a very typical thing to do. I'm sure that most of you working at a company in-house have hired consultants. As a consultant, I thank you for that. I think it's nice to get a paycheck every now and then. But how do consultants typically work? And this is in Finland, I think, very typical, is that we sell our expertise with the idea that we are experts and we will remain experts so that we can keep on selling our expertise. The client becomes dependent of our work. Whereas, this is what I firmly believe, and like I said, I'm also a consultant, so I'm allowed to say this. I think that when I'm hired as a consultant, it's my obligation to work in a way that makes me redundant. It's I should be hired so that one day they won't need me anymore. Instead of vendor locking them, giving them only bits and pieces of my secrets, just enough to have them salivating for my expertise, but not enough to make them self-sufficient on their own. So we have these world-class people, and this is so typical, and it's driving me so mad, that we hire these world-class experts, best in their trade, best analytics people, best developers, and what do? We ask them to produce a monthly report for us. Every month at the same time, just do some SEO stuff and just give me a report. And then they do that. And then everybody is satisfied. The company is just spending thousands of euros for nothing, but whatever. So we're misusing these people because they're still outsiders to the process. They're not in that little huddle there. Because when we've built those communication structures, we're forgetting the fact that consultancies and outsourcing and remote work are totally fundamental to how the digital process works these days. So what is the solution? Again, prepare to get your minds blown. Bring them in. Like, how do you do this? Well, instead of just communicating with the consultant once a month, asking for the report, or just having them Skyping every now and then, have them stand in the daily meetings with you. They don't have to say anything. That's the beauty of Agile. You can just hover around like this, not say anything, and you're still being agile. It's so easy. But have the consultants come in and teach you everything they know about what they're doing. Be transparent. When I'm invited as a consultant, what do? I talk to the developers and tell them how Google Tag Manager works. I could go the nasty way and just say that you don't have to worry about that, I'll do all that stuff, don't worry about it, I'll do that. But then I'm vendor locking, I'm losing that trust, I'm not supporting the communication structure. Instead, I tell them exactly what I did, why I did it, and how it works, so that one day the developers can do that by themselves. And now if you're wondering, wow, that's a really bad business model because I'm just talking myself out of a job. Well, guess what? Once the developers do that stuff really well, you know what you can do? Some other cool stuff. You know, you can focus your time on doing other things. You can focus your time on optimizing the processes, refactoring, writing tests, you know, all sorts of things. And maybe one day you will be redundant, and good for you. There are other fish in the sea. But this is what we're trying to build here. We're trying to build a machine that is founded on communication, because the first thing that happens when this process starts working really beautifully is that the finger pointing and the blaming others stops. Agile has a setting called retrospective, which is where you can, you know...
Hey.
Whoa. What? Sorry. I was obviously going out of line there, and the guy upstairs said that stop now. So we're trying to build this process, and at its best, everything is just rolling smoothly. And those communication errors that we talked about, they start disappearing simply because people are talking before they're doing. So when I'm trying to figure out, okay, so how many decimals does this revenue value need? I don't do it blindly because I'm the expert. I talk with the team and say, okay, so you're doing mobile analytics, so what's your format? What are you doing? Oh, 2 decimals? Oh, 4 decimals? Okay, I'll use 4 decimals as well. And I'll show you a reason why that's so important in a bit. But this is what we're trying to do. We're not trying to get the best tools. We're not trying to get the best strategies. We're trying to get the best communication, because that breeds knowledge sharing. I don't know how many people of you are going to Measure Camp on Saturday, but think of Measure Camp in Moscow as a kind of a big scale this. People are huddled around the same idea, talking with an open mind to each other, and then take that learning and take it back to your company and think about how you could do that on a daily basis. So one of the places where communication structures, and going back to Conway's law, is especially visible are the data pipelines that we build. So I think we've gone beyond just talking about GA and just talking about Firebase and just talking about Yandex. And now we're thinking about the big picture. To what are these pipelines bringing data? What is the big data warehouse? What is the data lake that we want to build? And what do we want to do with that aggregated data? So communication breakdown is especially pungent in these data pipelines. And I'll show you why. This is a totally imaginary cloud pipeline on the Google Cloud. It's not imaginary in that it's impossible. This is a very typical framework, but I just threw a couple of company names there and a couple of icons, and I'll tell you what the icons do. But what we have here is we have 3 different distinct data sources. We're using this tool called Snowplow Analytics for offline measurements. So we're measuring foot traffic to a store and what people are doing, buying stuff with their loyalty cards. We're using GA for mobile analytics. Okay. That's cool. First time that's ever happened. And then we're using Google Analytics for mobile stuff. So mobile analytics, and we're using Yandex on the web also for things like session replays and so on. So, and then we're streaming this data into a data pipeline. This is what the pipeline might look like. This is on the Google Cloud. So we have, oh, maybe there's no. So we have BigQuery, which is like the Google's OLAP data warehouse. BigQuery sends that data through a couple of data flow processes to this brain thingy, which is the machine learning engine in BigQuery in the Google Cloud. And then we have Google Data Studio where we want to visualize it. So we have 3 distinct data sources, and then we have a pipeline that tries to bring all that data together. Now let's see where all those communication problems lie. At data collection, when the data is being collected, that's the first place, of course. Because if you screw up data collection, you screw up the whole pipeline, right? If you forgot to measure something, there's no way to go back in time and fix it. So data collection is crucial. We need things like naming conventions. Are we talking about the same things with the same words? Are the events annotated in the same way? Are we talking about a user with the same way? Unified IDs. Are we using the same user ID across all these systems, the same authentication ID? We need to if we want to build a full customer journey. Authentication and privacy. Are we keeping in mind that some of these platforms might have much stricter privacy regulations than the others? There are certain things you just can't collect in GA. So we need to be mindful of these things. This is the first place where communication is absolutely fundamental. So then we bring them into the pipeline. And at this point, when we're talking about ETL, so extracting and transforming and loading that data into these warehouses, we need to talk about maybe one of these pipelines is working on a batch process, so they only upload the data once per day, and maybe the other pipelines do a constant stream of data, so every 10 minutes they upload the data. If you want to bring all that together, you have to be mindful of the fact that one system does a data dump once a day, and the others do them constantly, so if you want to align them in the same chronology, you have to be mindful of this, and you have to make sure they are time-stamped correctly and that there's a load process that updates the model, updates the timelines correctly. Hit validation, same thing. What if Yandex has a system whereby invalid hits are also loaded so that you can fix them later, but GA doesn't have that. GA, if a hit is invalid, GA doesn't collect it, it just drops it. So again, you have a potential communication structure here where you need to discuss with the different teams doing the ETL what the processes are like. And I mean, ETL is a wonderful tool. It's so easy to just collect stuff and then we'll have a good ETL in place that will fix it. It will, fill those holes and it will fix those formatting issues. But every single ETL process that you see is redundant by definition. You shouldn't need it if the data is good at its source and if the batching and streaming processes are perfect. Then comes the interesting part where you have to kind of make sure that the data is being aggregated correctly. And at this point, you're almost in the goal, so it's really important that you're accumulating the data correctly. So what are you doing with invalid data? Are you patching it like I just mentioned, or are you just throwing it away? And if you're throwing it away, what's going to happen to it? So it's a place where you need these two people to communicate, or these two teams. And if you notice, there's always the plus previous on every stage, because every single stage inherits the problems of the previous stage. So if you screw up data collection, it will flow through every single stage as a constant reminder in the back of your head that, by the way, this data is flawed. And then you enter the most crucial part of any pipeline, which is the place where you'll know if the communication actually worked between all these teams. This is when those different pipelines are finally brought together. And in this example, we're bringing them together in two different places, no less. One is Google's ML engine, so we're building machine learning models directly off this aggregated data. Now, I don't know how much you know about machine learning, but I can tell you this, that it's totally dependent on good quality data. So if you have a data set that is polluted from one source but good from another source, it's very difficult to do a reliable model on that data because you don't know which part of the model is based on feature engineering that's based on good data and which part is based on flawed data. Because when they're aggregated, it's all the same. Same thing with the final data warehouse, BigQuery. If you load all the data into a single huge BigQuery table, then the bad quality data and the good quality data will be mixed. So and in the visualization, that's, this is the most fundamental part of it all, because that's when the CEO sees the data, right? That's when they come into the room with the dashboard and say, wow, we just got so much more revenue this year than last year. So how come our financial numbers are actually in the red? This is the point where the flaws and the imperfections are too late. There's so much stuff happening before this that if it ends up in the dashboard, you're already kind of screwed. But what I'm trying to point out here is just a simple thing, that we have so many different people and so many different tools and so many different strategic mindsets and so many different consultants that are looking at, and this is a simplified pipeline. I think it's very simple. It has a vertical flow, a linear flow from top to the bottom. There's no feedback loops there. So it's a simple pipeline. And there are so many places where miscommunication and bad communication will break things down. It's mind-boggling. So I think it's intuitive that we have to do something about it. And when we look at these data sources, sorry, we can of course unravel the whole thing again. Like if we just look at Yandex and figure out what we want to measure with it, these are all communication topics. You know, it's like when you go on a blind date and you don't know what to talk about, you have these cards that give you different topics to talk about. It's the same. Well, it's been so long since I've been on a date, I don't know if it works like that. But, so we have to ask these questions from the data sources. What is purposeful? Are we collecting responsibly? What can we discard? What is actionable? We could just collect everything, you know, that was a very popular thing back a while ago. So instead of thinking about what to collect, let's just collect every single thing we can from the website. Let's dump it in a data lake and then hope that someday somebody figures out what to do with it. I don't think that's a sustainable strategy. And especially coming from Europe with GDPR, which has very strict data retainment policies, it's not even legal at the moment. You're not even allowed to collect redundant data. You have to have a purpose for the data. So there's complexity everywhere. Like, when the data pipeline is built and you're just looking at the dashboard as the CEO, it's easy to think, wow, that looks very simple. I see a nice pie diagram and a nice bar graph and I see a big green number on how well we're doing. It looks very easy, but there's so much complexity underlying this. And to wrap up this talk, I want to show you one example of this complexity. And the reason I want to also do this is because I will not do a single talk ever where I don't show at least a little bit of code. So I want to do that. So one of the things, if you've been doing e-commerce analytics, actually if you've been doing any kind of conversion optimization analytics, is the fact that you want to negotiate the fact that people see things on the site, like banners and product images, and then they click those banners and those product images. And you measure the click-through rate of these different positions and try to figure out which position is getting the best clicks. Like what Google is doing with their search engine, what Yandex is doing with search engine, trying to figure out the optimal placement to get the best clicks per impression, get the best click-through rate. Now the de facto way of doing impression measurement is to just send those impressions as soon as the visitor loads the page. Send a big hit with every single impression of a thing on the page, even if the user didn't actually view those things. And why is it so? Because that's the easy way to do it. It's easy to not figure out, is the user actually looking at something, but just to dump them all in one big hit. So what I want to show you is where complexity lies and how this relates to the whole pipeline thing is this idea of true view e-commerce impressions. So only send an impression to your analytics tool when the user actually views the impression. So when it floats into the viewport, when it's actually visible in the user's screen. Now the people in the audience probably are figuring out, well, we still don't know if the user is viewing that thing, right? We don't know what's going on in their mind. They could be looking somewhere else and just scrolling the page. I mean, short of, I don't know if you know how to do it, you could kind of turn on the webcam and look at what they're looking at, but I'm not sure that's okay. So, and here's how the discussion, like we're talking about communication structure, so here's how, this is an almost one-to-one reenactment of a talk I had with a client. I'm not going to tell you which one of those I am, but an analyst turned up and said that, hey, we've been measuring the CTR of our banners this whole time without actually knowing if the impressions were viewed. So the click-through rate for those banners was actually lower, was showing lower in the analytics tool because every single time a page was loaded, every single impression was sent on the page. Whereas only the actual clicks were being sent as the clicks. So the click-through rate was lower than in reality. And this was a concern to this analyst. So then the business people took the ball and said, yeah, we need qualified impressions. I mean, that's how we run our business. If we're doing like cost per mil data, CPM data, we can't use impressions that were never viewed. That would be throwing the money down the drain. We need to know which one of these banners actually has the best click-through rate. It might have the most clicks, but that's not the same thing as the best click-through rate because it's always a ratio of the clicks and the impressions. And then the marketing people say, you know, we can also use the CTR to just better design our creatives. If we see that a specific kind of creative is getting consistently the best CTR, then we should use this. So we're building the story, we're actually specifying the thing while we're going through this discussion. The developers will of course say that, yeah, we can do that, that's a good idea. We have a technical solution at hand. We have GTM, we know we can do this. We can measure it, we can measure impressions by seeing where the user is scrolling down the page and what is visible in the browser window when they reach a product. And then the UX people have found a fringe benefit which says that, yeah, that's a good idea. And by the way, when we have this CTR data, not only should we use it for measuring the effectiveness of our campaigns, we can also measure it, should we use lazy load or should we use pagination? Because both of those have an impact on the impression measurement. So if you know lazy load or infinite load, it means that everything is on the same page, but as you scroll down, more and more things appear. So more and more impressions are being sent as you scroll down. So how do we do this? Well, we look at the pipeline, and this is now a critical step again. Let's say all of those three systems are currently doing impression tracking. So GA is measuring impressions on the app. Snowplow is interestingly measuring what the foot traffic is seeing, what are the products that are on the aisles, and what people are picking up and buying. And Yandex is measuring the traffic on the website. So the thing is, if we now only fix this in Yandex, what happens? We end up with the problem of having three different data sets again, and we'll need some way of patching them together because GA and Snowplow are still measuring impressions the old way. And this is very typical. So as a GA consultant myself, I tend to think of myself as a silo. I came up with a good idea, I'll just do it in GA, and then at least we'll say that, hey, GA works, your problems are not my problems. But then we'll end up with a pipeline that is completely busted again because we don't know which part of the impressions are factual, like qualify, and which part are the ones where we just send all the impressions with every hit. So we need to have this discussion. We need to share, I need to share with the other teams that, hey, by the way, we've decided to adopt this different type of impression tracking. Are you guys on board too? Are you going to do that in your platforms? Cool. So then we'll design the schema, we'll design the measurement plan, and we'll make sure that it's implemented the same way in all the data sources so that we don't need an embarrassing amount of ETL to fix it. And then you'll get all these slides, so no need to copy all the code. But we can do this whole thing with GTM. And because I wanted to show you code, here we go. So the way it actually works is that it simply measures the time when you scroll down and more products appear in the screen. We use the visibility trigger in GTM to say that, hey, this product is now visible, this product is visible, this product is visible. And then we wait until there's a batch of these products, like 10 or 20 products, and then we send them to GA and say, these impressions were actually viewed by the visitor. Or they could have been viewed. The visitor had the possibility of seeing those products. So what do we end up with? We end up with a report like this, where we have the different positions and the placements of the impressions. We have how many times each placement was viewed, how many times they were clicked, what the click-through rate is, and then what the e-commerce fallout from that click was. So did people end up buying the stuff that we viewed? And now, before we'd made this change, there's no way we could trust that data. The CTR data is not trustworthy because we don't know how many of those views are real views. We don't have that information. We only know that these are the number of times the pages were loaded with those impressions. So now we have true views, so view impressions that were actually viewed, which result in qualified clicks. So the clicks only happen on impressions that were actually viewed by the person. We get a true click-through rate. We get qualified cart ads, purchase, and so on. Everything becomes qualified simply by virtue of modifying the data that we get in that first column. And this is what we're trying to do here. We're trying to optimize the tools that we use by sharing knowledge in that organization. And then we're telling the other people in the organization what we're doing so that we can avoid those pesky data quality issues that necessarily crop up if we don't have the communication structure in place. So I guess in my final minutes, what I want to say is that we're all here today. Wait, what? That's how a wedding speech starts. Let's not do that one. We're sitting here today because we know that this stuff is difficult. right? If this stuff were easy, then this would just be a networking session and we'd be having beers in the garden or something. But we know that this stuff is really, really difficult because we know that data quality is something you have to work towards so that you earn good data quality. If a company or a vendor comes to you and says, just install this tool and we'll give you the best data quality, that's acquired data quality, and I don't believe in that message. I don't believe it's true. There's always a process. We need to hire the right people. We need to build those communication structures. So the key takeaways are that data quality is an investment. It's never just buying the right tool, never just hiring the right strategists. It's also spending a lot of overhead into building those communication structures because they are absolutely everything. Everything. Every single problem I've run into can somehow, with some twist of logic, be found in a missing or broken communication structure between two people who didn't talk with each other. And I want to heal that relationship. So much of consultancy for me today is being a therapist and trying to heal those organizations with these communication problems. Customization is really necessary. We can't, and if you're going to, I have a talk in a couple of hours in the other room. I'm going to be talking more about customization. So it's fundamental. We need to turn these tools and not use like GA's default impression metric or Yandex's impression metric. We have to tell them what are true impressions. But in the end, what we want, what we dream of is that that data is being put into some place, into good use. And for that, it just has to be really good quality. It has to have the support of all the other tools in the organizations, and the data pipeline just must be healthy. So with that, I have a mic, and I'm willing to do like a mic drop, but I don't want to break it, so thank you very much for your attention.
Simo Ahava, we have only one micro for both of us. Any questions? Вопросы?
Questions?
One question. I'm also working on the same consultancy side, and I wonder what's the best approach to optimize the time you spend on the scrums and agile, since if the amount of clients grow and then you're involved in all these conversations and they are important, how can potentially a consultant cut down on communication that is unnecessary without losing the ability of properly talking to the businesses?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and at the heart of the consultancy model is that it's a very difficult thing to negotiate, because by default you don't have just one client. And a fully functional like software development agile process requires 24/7 attendance. Or no, that's a Silicon Valley thing. 7.5 hours a day, let's agree on that. So you need to be present. And you don't need to actually talk about stuff, you just need to be present. So that's very difficult if you have 5 clients, because you can only devote 1 day for each. So the way that I've done that is I try to avoid having 5 clients. So as long as I'm coaching the agile process and being the analyst, I just have to keep my clients down and maybe hire more people to take on the other additional load. So it is in the same way that a developer working on that project won't have many projects. They'll be working solely on that. So if you want to do like a full good job, and if you can price it correctly, because it's very difficult to price as well, but you need to be devoted to a single client or 1 or 2 clients at a time. It's just how it is. If on the other hand, you're caught in a place where you have more than 1 client, then I have found no better way to do it except to start with devoting a set amount of 1 or 2 sprints per client. So only 1 client for a sprint. Just start with, show them what you're doing, tell them what you're doing, share the knowledge. And then after that, do the other sprint with the other client and so on. So it takes a bit more time, but after that you can just lower your participation to dailies and the demos. Like dailies and the demos are the 2 most important parts for that analyst. Or that's your goal, because you want those sprint plannings to work without you. Like one of the things as an analytics developer, again this is shooting myself in the foot, but I don't think we're necessary in the developer part of things at all. The stuff we do with JavaScript is ridiculously easy for any front-end engineer. So it's only in the beginning of the project that we have to tell them, hey, this is how GTM works, this is how stuff works, this is what analytics requires from the web design. And after that, I hope that they can do it by themselves. So what we do is, Agile has this thing called a definition of done, which basically lists the steps that need to be passed for the sprint to be a success. So every time the sprint is over, we look at those steps and see, did the sprint fulfill all these requirements? And one of those steps is analytics. So when developers develop features, in addition to writing documentation, writing the code, peer testing, and then unit testing and so on, they also have to have the discussion with the team. So should we measure this? Is this important enough to measure? And that's what I make myself available to. So they can call me. It doesn't have to be during the, actually it shouldn't be during the daily because that's not where you do this stuff. But they can call me when they start working on the feature and we can have a talk that, yeah, I think that sounds pretty interesting. Let's talk with the business people as well. Do you need this analytics? So you become a facilitator. You help them have the discussions. An analyst is in the perfect place to be this kind of a facilitator because your trade is multidisciplinary. You have input for the developers, how to write the code. You have input for the UX, how to design those tests. For the business, how to analyze the data, and so on. So, and this is difficult for a consultant who sells analytics as a product. Because what you're morphing into is less of an analyst and more of an organization coach. So it is a difficult thing. If you only have a few clients, you can just throw yourself at it if the client agrees to buy this like full-time work from you. But the data is difficult, stuff applies here too. This is a really difficult process. And of course, I'm talking at a conference, so I'm painting a perfect picture here. I'm allowed to do that. It's a total utopia. I'm still trying to work towards that. I have only a handful of clients in my professional history where I've been satisfied with the process. And like 99% of my clients I'm still struggling with trying to make it work. But the one thing, which is why I'm talking about this today, is that everybody understands the fact that communication is important and having the analyst facilitate these processes is important. The difficult part is changing these old, big, monolithic organizations to be more agile. That's the difficult part. And there's a whole different talk about that maybe next year here, but not today. Yeah. But very good question.
Thanks.
Cheers, man.
We have time for one more question, I think.
Hi, Simo. Thank you for presentation. I also believe that communication is the key to success, but let's say it's not a question, it's my personal pain in some way. Talking about data quality and making world better and so on, sometimes I face with the problem, let's say we made a fix, we start collecting data like in a better way, and it shows like some negative things, I don't know, some problems in marketing and so on, and people start saying, why did you do that? We lived in a better world and so on, and here's the problem raises how to persuade people that this is correct, like with this CTR example you showed that, okay, don't show like all impressions, but only when the person sees these blocks and so on.
Okay, yeah, that's such a funny thing. So I recognize that people get angry when you fix the data and it shows that they're actually not doing that well after all. So this is like in A/B testing. I have this every single time I go to a new client. We do a test and we get a negative result, and then we start talking about the result and try to spin it in a way that it's positive. And things like bounce rates and conversion rates are always like, don't touch it, it's good now. Don't fix it, it's perfect now. So, you know, I'm at a loss when that comes to place because I'm honest. Again, communication is the only way that will fly through. But you need to paint it like, you need to paint it in a way that the other person understands. So I would never ever explain to a CEO how our mutation observer API in our current JavaScript build does not understand how these true view. I would not use that language with them, but I would show them that, hey, we're throwing this much money into something that we don't know is factually correct. And if I can show them that there's a negative effect from that the numbers are actually worse and it does show up, and I can do that. This is like, I think this is part and parcel of what being a consultant is like. You're spinning stories. You're the expert, and if the company doesn't trust you enough that what you say is actually factually correct and you've spent time in researching it, then it's of course there's something bigger problems there. But I think the first thing you need to do in those cases is get the buy-in from the team around you. Start small. show them what's going on and make them understand and build that support. Because at some point, and you know, actually, let me take that back one step. In some cases, I say, okay, have your bad data. You know, sometimes it's just not worth the effort. If that company is not mature enough to understand that there might be flaws in data, then that's usually a time for me to step back. But now I fully understand that it's a privileged position to be able to step back from a client. Not new businesses don't have that opportunity. So in there, and I've done this, one of the strategies is to play along for a while. And little by little start pointing finger at the inconsistencies. Start saying that, hey, I mentioned this last time, but we're still getting these impressions. And then show them the weird thing that when you load a page with 100 products where only 3 are visible, show them how all those 100 impressions are sent with the load. You can show them. You can show them using the computer and just show them that this is the case. And then have them realize that, hey, yeah, there's something fishy going on. And if they still don't accept that that's a problem, I don't know. Then it's either you backing down or you playing along if you're like really, if the client is really important for you. I think it's okay to fake it. It's okay to live in a bad relationship and just fake it. And just, if that's necessary for your survival as a company, keeping in mind that this is only a phase for you. You will graduate out of it once you have the income and you can turn to better clients. But there are bad clients and there are bad organizations and there are bad companies. It's not just about clients, there are bad people and bad relationships. And I just try to, sounding like a broken record, but at that point I'd start looking for those communication problems because there obviously are. But it's very difficult as a consultant to suggest you need to fire that one person who is in the heart of all these problems. That just doesn't work. So in those cases, personally I don't waste my time with them. I think it's too much effort, too much stress trying to play along with this big lie, but it might be a privileged position at the same time.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Simo, for detailed and helpful answers. Thank you.